Did you know that postpartum and postpartum depression are two different things? Well, I kind of thought they were two different things, but sometimes I hear these terms and I start thinking that they're one and the same, and they're really not. Jane Honikman is on this podcast to talk to us about postpartum, what it means, and the differences between postpartum depression, and all these different terms. She is the author of Postpartum is Forever, and you are going to enjoy listening to our conversation that's open and honest and a little bit raw at times. So stay tuned for an interesting and fascinating conversation. Hello, and welcome to the Cool Grandpa Podcast. This is your host, Greg Payne, coming at you from Studio 12. This podcast is about being the best possible grandpa you can be, focusing on what it is to be a grandpa and how we can all share that experience together for our grandchildren. I know it's still July, but in a few short weeks, it's going to be September, and that means Grandparents Academy is having another awesome Grandparents Week. Now, Grandparents Week is where you've got experts around this topic of being a grandparent that come in and share their expertise to really help other grandparents learn a little bit more about different topics that are impacting us as well as our grandchildren. Now, Grandparents Week is free to sign up, although there is a paid part of that program. So what I want you to do is go to grandparentsacademy.com, or you can go to my website, check out the affiliate links, and then click over and sign up and reserve your seat today for Grandparents Academy Grandparents Week. The other part that I want to talk to you about is More Than Grand. More Than Grand has some great resources for new grandparents as well as new parents. These resources are sure to help you start off your relationship and this journey of being a grandparent as successful as possible. So go to my affiliate link, check it out, and look for any of the products that really strike a nerve with you. You'll be happy you did. The last thing I want to talk to you about is I've got a new website design. We've refreshed it, so it's got a lot of great, easy to navigate through areas where you can find the podcast resources. You can find affiliate links. You can find all sorts of things over at cool-grandpa.us. So go over and check out the refreshed website. And without further ado, let's jump into our conversation with Jane Honikman. Hi, Jane. Welcome to the Cool Grandpa Podcast. I'm excited to have you on to talk about this subject of postpartum and postpartum depression that a lot of grandpas, we hear the terms and then we kind of walk out of the room, or we're kind of, sometimes shepherded out of the room. So this is going to be exciting to learn more about this important thing because we've all got daughters and daughter-in-laws that this may affect, and we want to be prepared and we want to be engaged. So thank you for joining us.
Thanks for the invitation, Greg. It's an honor.
As we get started with our conversation, I'd love for you to introduce yourself a little bit to the audience and discuss your background and how we got started with postpartum and research and the support groups and books and everything that you've got going on.
Okay, well, it is a long story since now I am a lot older than when I got started, but it did begin with an unplanned pregnancy, and my future husband and I, it was the 1960s, so it was a time when you did not do what we did and get away with it. We ended up placing our first baby for adoption, so that was off to a rocky start in terms of our own parenthood. But we did marry, and then we did get the, proverbial, isn't it wonderful? Now we're married, now we have the house, now we'll have children, and now we'll know exactly what to do. Well, guess what? It wasn't like that at all. So I think it's very important to be open and honest with one another. And as I tell my story, it's a story that was a secret for many, many decades. So that is a trauma that we had, that we ignored, the impact it would have on our marriage and our future relationships. But it did propel me into my career. And that happened because when we did finally get pregnant and have our next baby, we were isolated from our families. We lived in a new community, and we had a new job, new house, and making friends. And then we have this baby. But I made friends with other women in an organization that gave out grants for doing community advocacy. And we got a grant for $500 and started an organization called Postpartum Education for Parents. We called it PEP for short. And it's important to sort of take apart these three words, because the word postpartum was like, nobody had that in their vocabulary. Nobody talked about anything after you had the birth. And it's the 70s by this time. And of course, that's when we were, as women and feminists, saying, okay, husband, partner, you got us pregnant. You better come in that delivery room. You better be there for us. You're going to change diapers. All of this role changing that was going on because of the women's movement. It was very significant. So PEP stands for, as I say, the period right after the baby arrives, because it was also the beginning of the childbirth education movement. And so we were getting, this is how you make sure you have a natural, quote unquote, birth. But nobody mentioned the fact that you have responsibility for a human being, and nobody told you how to do that. So we decided we needed to talk about it openly and honestly. We were doing that as friends. The other part of the title is to use the word parents, because this is never, ever, ever just a woman's issue. Never. Because to my knowledge, no egg has ever gotten impregnated without a sperm. So we do need to acknowledge this is gender inclusive, I want to use the words. And yet we have women, we definitely are the ones who show pregnancy unless it's an unusual circumstance of that's another whole topic. Now we have men also having pregnancies. But there was just this whole idea that we were just going to be overwhelmed by this responsibility and know what to do. We didn't. And that led to this idea of a warm line, the idea that you can have all these questions and all these challenges and all these feelings, but there's nobody to really talk to about that. So we started the first warm line in the United States. It's still going on today. That's staffed entirely by parents who are trained volunteers, and there's no paid staff. And the concept is very simple. The idea is not to be judged, to feel safe that you can say how you're feeling. And that goes for men and women. So that's my background in terms of being an activist. And it really was propelled by the fact that I thought I was ready, that we were all ready to be parents, and we clearly were not. But it also launched me into doing more work and discovering more research and all these things that happen to you by accident, because I wasn't intentionally trying to create a career. It's now I call it parental mental health. I call it being an advocate for parents. And now that I've aged even further, and now our children have had children, I'm advocating for the grandparents. So that's something that's really not been discussed at all. So when I found you, I was just thrilled, because this is an audience we are all neglected as we age up. So I've written quite a few books, and they also reflect my exposure to the topic as I learned from the experts and researchers about mental illness. It's like, what are you talking about illness? We're just talking about challenges. What are you talking about mental illness for? Oh, well, it turns out there's a big undiscussed area of mental health that does pertain to parenthood. And again, it affects men and women, and it affects the next generations. And the reason we need to be talking about this as grandparents is that we are impacted when we're notified that we are indeed going to become grandparents. Sometimes it brings up memories of how it was or wasn't for us. And as you can well imagine, for me, having given up my first baby, and I put that in the personal because my husband wasn't present for that experience and he was not traumatized like I was, but you do worry about these things. In fact, you have to worry about not being overly involved in the beginning, because then you get in trouble, and that's called being meddlesome. You have to learn to keep your mouth shut You remember exactly what it felt like when you didn't sleep, or you really want to be helpful, and yet the parents are looking at you like, what are you doing? You trying to tell us what to do? No, this is our baby. So grandparenthood has its whole another kit and caboodle of emotions, and it's complicated. And I think it's also on our agenda now that we're talking about mental health as a society to recognize the intergenerational aspect of good health, both physical and mental, in families. And again, that's what's been neglected. I really think that if we can start being more honest about it, we would do well to get it out of the closet, so to speak. So you asked about my background. I hope that's a roundabout way of describing a little bit of myself. You want to ask another question?
That was a great explanation about how we've gotten connected, as well as the background with the books and the different organizations that you've become a part of. So I appreciate that. I would like us, though, to define postpartum versus postpartum depression, because I think for me, when I hear postpartum, I'm automatically thinking postpartum depression. But as I've read your book and I've started to learn more about this, it's actually two different things, although sometimes it might be referenced the same way.
Yes, unfortunately, the success of PEP, when we started PEP, and then I went on to start Postpartum Support International, it became defined as depression, and that is inaccurate. It's called misinformation, and it stemmed from success, which is kind of ironic. What I wanted to do is correct that misinformation and get the word out that when you say you've had a baby, whether through adoption or whether you, as a grandparent, maybe you've had custody now of your grandchildren, and you're a caregiver, all of these situations that can come up for us as family members, you are postpartum because you have a live child that you care for. We forget this. The word postpartum just means after. Post, after, and partum is birth, the arrival of a child. And the other part of this, women thinking or society thinking it's depression only. We also say, oh, it's maternal. It's maternal mental health. No, it's not, because men get depressed too, and grandmas and grandpas get depressed, and whole family members can be just turned on their upside down, tipsy-turvy when it comes to things that are not what I call wonderful. So yes, it became synonymous with depression, which is inaccurate on a lot of levels. One is that there are so many different ways we can respond emotionally to stress. Depression is just a one word, but in fact, it's the flip side of another word, which is anxiety. Depression and anxiety are part of a spectrum of reactions. It's called a continuum of reaction by some people in the field. And we have people who do become very mentally ill and can have what we call a psychosis. But men can also have a psychotic break. Now, what in the world is that all about? Because we tend to think, well, it's a woman's only. She had the baby. It's her hormones. No, it's not like that. I think it's important at this moment to go through some key reasons people have what we call less than wonderful. And I think I'm going to just read them through and make sure we understand these, what we call causes, really begin with our own neurobiology. It's called vulnerability or predisposition, that some of us are inclined to have, again, a tendency toward a reaction that's biological, and then we label it, and it's clinical and it's medical. But there's also family history. So there's a lot of things if we wanted to prevent what, again, is not okay and is in the extreme. We have to know our genealogy. We need to know our family histories. We need to be open and honest and talk about this. And again, I'm very upfront about my own experiences that my father was bipolar. That's what he called it in the old days, manic depression. So there was family mental illness and I had to figure that out. And nobody talked about any of this kind of thing. This is extremely difficult as a child growing up in the 20th century. Didn't know what was wrong with my father. Did that make me, at risk? Yes, it really does make you at risk for how you respond to things and again, neurobiologically. But then there's also the third thing that we need to be open about is trauma and traumatic experiences. And I was at risk for something less than wonderful happening to me, subsequent pregnancies. And again, this is impactful on all the family members. And my poor husband, who's clueless about all this, had to put up with me. And again, we were in the dark ages when we were having our children last century. We know so much more. That's good. But the trauma, the fact that I had relinquished and never saw my firstborn, and I was in a foreign country, and I suppressed all of that. So we all have baggage. We all have secrets. We all have things that we really need to talk about. And when we get pregnant with somebody, pregnancy is the opportunity. We call it the window of opportunity. Pregnancy is the time when, as a couple, the partners, and with other family members, that means the grandparents, because that's the heredity part, you need to be open and honest during pregnancy. What are our risk factors? What are things that could have happened? Now the baby comes. Well, even during pregnancy, we have changes in sleep patterns that are just horrific for the brain. Now, some people handle this better than others. I'm not good at that. I need my sleep. So this is another factor making you feel just dreadful. Another is simply what we call normal stress becomes increased stress to the point where you just cannot tolerate it. And then you usually take out your stress loads in lashing out, perhaps with anger. We know it's a sign of depression to be angry. We also know for men, there tends to be more anger expressed outwardly than with women, who can become much more withdrawn. But those are, again, responsibilities. But how do you have a baby? How do you reproduce without having loss of sleep? How do you deal with all this responsibility? Well, again, it depends on how healthy we are neurobiologically. Okay, there's another one as a kicker, is the relationship and the partnerships that we have. How strong are you married? Does it matter? What's the partnership going like? How are you talking to each other? But that's a terrifically important one. Again, it's very tough during the pregnancy to live with a pregnant person. We can all know that we change. But I'm going to bring up the men and their hormones right away, because what we know now is that the rates of what we refer to as postpartum depression and anxiety are very similar in men and in women. Even though we don't have as much good research on men yet, we do know that they've noticed, for example, anthropologists who study other cultures have seen that men, in fact, can gain weight and have sleepless nights during pregnancy. Now, what's that all about? And one theory is that if they're sleeping next to a pregnant woman, there's a crossover through the skin of hormones. And that's something of interest. We don't think about that. But if we're tuned into each other, we will certainly see that we get cranky or upset. We have a lot of fears. We have a lot of decisions to be made. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone's going to get depressed. It means it's just tough, and these are challenges. And if you're smart about it, you can do some preparation during pregnancy. And one of the books that I've co-written with a man who's an expert in all of this is called Parental Mental Health Factoring in Fathers. And this book was designed specifically to get the conversation going about how men are affected and during pregnancy and during the postpartum period, and again into grandparenthood. And I'm going to also share that I took the knowledge that primarily from my co-author, who's Dan Stingley, and he's an expert on fathers and men as a therapist, psychologist. And then I turned it into all the information that he shares and the research into a workbook. And again, this is something for men, I believe, like to do stuff to make you feel like you're participating, and it can be good for grandfathers too. But there's a workbook that goes along with Parental Mental Health Factoring in Fathers, the workbook. And during pregnancy, you can fill in the blanks. talk to each other, go through, what does it mean to be a man? I mean, I learned a lot from Dan when we were writing this book together, because I'm a woman. I can say what it feels like to be a female, but I don't have a clue, even though I have sons-in-law, and a husband. I really like and enjoy the company of men. I've never been a man, so I don't know. But I think the conversation, again, is very, very important. And the workbook is an idea to help that along. And also, what else did I want to emphasize? What else, Greg? What would I emphasize at that moment?
I was also interested to know from like a historical perspective, because you were using yourself and your husband as an example from the 60s forward. But how have we typically in, let's say, Western society handled postpartum depression? I mean, from a historical standpoint, what do we know about it? And then how has that started to evolve, let's say, over the last 10 to 20 years?
Well, it has definitely improved. Our knowledge is increasing because I founded Postpartum Support International. And by doing that and becoming an advocate and speaking out, I was able to take knowledge that I was learning from the researcher, because I was attending their conferences, and get the word out through this organization called PSI for short, Postpartum Support International. We still have a long way to go. I mean, I still have people coming up to me or emailing me and saying, I had no idea, nobody ever told me I was going to be feeling like this. And so we still struggled with stigma. And stigma, as we know since COVID, and that's the silver lining of having gone through the pandemic, is that at least we're talking about emotional reactions and clinical depression and things that really do need medical intervention. But we also need plain friendship. We need social support. We need to be able to say, this is how I'm feeling. That's one of the biggest changes, I think, that my generation from the mid-20th century into now is to try to emphasize social support. And by that, I mean, you have to be able to find somebody you can talk to so you're not alone. Now, there's a lot of negative about social media right now, but there's a lot of plus sides about it too. So long as we correct our language and we don't say that postpartum means depression, because it doesn't, we need to make sure we use the right language. But we have also had to acknowledge as women that this original idea of childbearing was absolutely a female phenomenon. Anthropologically, culturally, through all these thousands of years, it was a female-only task, role, and it was the females who took care of the pregnant and the postpartum and the baby, the mother and the baby. And the men were simply not included. And that, again, as we shifted that with understanding that that was kind of mean, actually, when you think about it, and short-sighted. But I also see it happening every day when you see something that says, oh, the baby's so wonderful, and you just show the mommy, and the mommy's changing the diapers. Or you see the men who are now taking such responsibility on a regular basis, and they don't get leave. They don't get paternity leave that they should. There should be parental leave for everybody. But all of these kinds of things need to be discussed. And I guess the other thing is that if we think about the economics, if the baby arrives, it's going to be the breadwinner still the man, because the woman is going to stay home. And I don't think that's true. We know statistically it's not true. And here's the role of the grandparent. The importance of how we navigate being supportive of our children who are giving birth and having babies now. What is our role? And so that's why I wrote Postpartum is Forever. This idea that social support is essential, that we talk about this, that we figure out how can I be helpful. So as we're speaking right now, my husband just came in from picking up our granddaughter and taking her home from school. So I couldn't do it today, so we shifted off back and forth. But I also want to mention something that's very, very troubling for me, is that there are examples in our society, but around the world, where grandparents are alienated, and they are in fact not allowed to participate in grandchildren. And the last time I did a talk on this topic of grandparenting, it was with a group in Scotland. And one of the participants had been and I think he's one of the founders, called Grandparents Apart. And that's the title of their support group. If you look and define what is a grandparent's rights, we have none. It's all about parental rights, unless it goes to the courts because of death of the biological parents or incarceration or drug abuse, any of these things that are very troubling and worrisome. That brings in the caregiving grandparent. But then they have the opposite when there may in fact be mental illness behind why some new parents say you can never see your grandchild. And I have been propelled. My passion is increased because of one of my girlfriends, who in fact was told never to call again. She sent a baby gift after the fourth baby arrived to the new parents, and it was sent back. All this pain and suffering that happens to grandparents because they're denied involvement. Now that's actually, according to Australians, the information I read from Australia is that they consider it elder abuse. And I think Americans should start looking at that we need to think about conversations that make more sense about what's going on when we do that horrible thing is to take away the right for grandchildren to know their grandparents. So that's kind of a sad part too.
Yeah, well, and I'm glad you brought that up, but I also want to make sure that when you have instances of parents telling grandparents not to contact the grandchildren or contact them, that may or may not have to do with postpartum depression. There could be some other things. So I just didn't want people listening to think, my daughter-in-law said don't call again, and so it must be this.
They have to be very careful about this. And again, that's why I want to get rid of the expression that depression is the word. It's not. We have to think of other words and other languages, and I also have to know a lot more about what is postpartum depression. And I've written books about that too, and there's lots online through PSI and other groups. But again, how old is the baby? How old is the baby is one of the first things you ask. During the pregnancy, the birth happens, and then there's an adjustment period, which is normal for having a lot of anxiety and depression. That's common. What's not okay is when it becomes clinical. And then we have to understand more. And again, as grandparents, we need to take care of ourselves and recognize that we could be getting depressed as well. And we have to know to take care of ourselves and our own mental health. It's only going to happen with open conversation and understanding the topics. Don't be afraid to learn more, because education is power, and that power can be turned into positivity. That's the right word. Does that help with that?
Yes, it does. And it leads me to my next question, which is I'm a Generation X grandfather, so I'm kind of on the tip of the spear of the new grandfathers, let's say. How can I be able to talk to my daughter-in-laws about what's coming when they're nervous? They may be first-time parents, or maybe they're going in for child number 3. I don't know, but how do I start to say, let them know, hey, I'm here, I'm a resource, right. I'm willing to talk. How do we bring that up?
You just do. So I have a wonderful testimonial letter that I want to read and share with your listeners that I think says a lot and answers your questions and your point. So it's just a direct quote. And this grandfather sent this to our local newspaper. And so it was published in our community. And it starts like this. As a 65-year-old father of 6 wonderful children, I thought I knew it all when it came to babies and parenthood. Our 5 oldest children had married and produced 15 grandchildren. When our youngest daughter had her baby boy, everyone was ecstatic and happy, we thought. But shortly after the birth, we noticed she was crying often, wanting others to care for the baby. She had a look of despair in her eyes. Everyone in the family sensed something was wrong. Fortunately, so did she, and she consulted her doctor. My oldest daughter came home one evening and said, "Dad, Michelle has postpartum depression, and we all have to help her through this." She explained how it was not her fault and something beyond her control, probably caused by a change in hormones, and it affects many mothers. I had never heard of such a thing. Days later, the new mommy called excitedly to inform me that she had just spoken to a volunteer with PEP, Postpartum Education for Parents, and that there was a support group in Santa Barbara for women with postpartum depression. My first reaction was, "Can I come?" So the following Thursday, mother, father, baby, older sister, and grandpa attended. Upon leaving our first meeting, I felt a great burden lifted from me. All the doubts and the thoughts I'd had about my daughter. Was she just being lazy? Was she being selfish? Was she jealous of the interaction? Upon leaving our first meeting, I felt a great burden lifted from me. All the doubts and thoughts I had about my daughter. Was she just being lazy? Was she being selfish? Was she jealous of the attention the new baby was getting? It all vanished. My message for grandpas is to go with your daughter or daughter-in-law to a support group. You will be glad you did. It's his experience, and this is from a man who obviously had seen it all, so to speak.
One of the things, too, that in your book, and I think just learning a little bit more about this, is that some of the depression that can come up could be different from child to child, birth to birth.
Absolutely.
That child number one, mom didn't have any issues, and she was out running the Boston Marathon a week later. All that kind of stuff, right?
Right.
Doesn't happen, but
Yeah.
But then child number three comes along, and all of a sudden it's just completely shut down. Whatever
Right.
happens, because to your point, you get in here and the hormones start changing, situations change. Maybe the husband's out of work during child number three.
Exactly.
Coming along. There's a lot going on there.
There's so much goes on, and every child is unique. Every pregnancy is unique, and every day is unique. Let's face it, you never know what's going to come your way. So again, that's why we have to check in. And one of the simplest things we do in a support group, and there should be support groups for grandparents, but there aren't enough at all, is to talk about your highs and your lows. How have you been? If it's a support group that's meeting every week, then there's a chance to say, well, how did your week go? And then you can say, well, actually, the baby didn't sleep last night, or, it could be anything. And again, if parent support groups are idyllic, because then you can really get people sharing across, from spouse to spouse. It doesn't happen that often that we have parent support groups as much as we have mommy and me groups. And if there is one thing I'd love more, it's more father to father, and then the grandparents together, because the conversations that happen over a cup of coffee, and that's the social support aspect of it. And I've been so lucky. The friends I had when we started having our children, we're still friends. And we still try to meet once a week, and we try to check in with each other and see how it's going. And that's, in fact, how the friend who has suffered from this alienation, she just passed away. She was never reunited with her grandchildren. And it just breaks my heart to think that she suffered so, and there's nothing I could do to help but be supportive of her during this time. It's just really, really sad. Anything else along that line that triggered?
It did, as far as what are some examples and maybe a few things that would cause a red flag, or that I should be looking for as far as a red flag with a daughter-in-law during this period?
Well, and also look at the fathers. It's usually, yes, it's male and female alike. It's usually, you can, if you know your loved ones well enough, you end up saying, are you having a bad day? Is there something bothering you? May I help you? If you have something you want to share? sometimes you have to wait. You might not get an honest answer for a long time, but the fact that you've asked, I'm concerned about you, and they shut you out, that's really hard. But it's probably only temporary, because that's probably indicative that there's something is wrong. But you can learn more about the signs and the symptoms, but it's, you can't, let's just go through what does clinical depression look like? Well, it means you're not sleeping well, or you're overly in bed a lot and you can't get up and out. But your sleep, your nutrition, your appetite is affected, and you cannot eat, or you eat too much. These two things are critical to the well-being of life, right? You have to sleep, you have to eat. But the third one is getting out and being able to be healthy and exercise and taking care of yourself. If you can see that somebody is simply shutting the door up and not going out when you know intuitively that that's not healthy. There are things you can do and say. It can sometimes, for grandparents, it can be tough. You have to be able to, walk that fine line and not being a meddling person, but to show concern is really good. To just try your best with that one, because that's correct. And that to understand in the brain, it really helps, because if you understand that the person, we are not getting enough sleep, we have not eaten recently, we have not gotten out of the house. You put it that in terms. I know I'm feeling poorly today because I did not, and fill in the blank. And you talk normally about that before conception, and you monitor each other as a family. That really, really is number one. Number one is to understand that our brains require good care. And we all then, let's be honest. How well did you sleep last night, Greg? How's it make you feel today? And then, of course, with hormonal changes, and there is a new baby, and there's a birth, and then there's a healing process, and everyone's different. I want to also bring in the fact that temperament of the child, and illness, premature babies, of course, bring up a whole lot more trauma. In some ways, the good news is that the medical community really rallies around families who are having disabilities, anything that you put a dis in front of, that's good. But when you see that person who looks really well made up, really well decked out, really, really doing everything, going to bed right on time, sleeping through the night, and they're smiling all the time, and then you worry about, I wonder how long that's going to last. Is that going to crash? Is there a potential, whoops, because we have to be in balance. It's about following nature's way, and also letting the children guide us too. So, you be present, and then we all grow up. All I can say is, after the 8th grandchild for us, we're much more in sync in how we can be helpful than it was with the first one. The first one, not at all.
Probably with the first one too, you're still establishing the relationship with the son or daughter-in-law, and you're still trying to figure
Correct.
where are some of the boundaries. Are they getting my sense of humor, or are they being offended? You're still kind of working through some of that. So
exactly. And on behalf of the grandparents who are listening to this, and grandpas in particular, the two barriers actually for us are how geographical distance. How far away are you? Do you get to see this newborn or the toddler or the other grandchildren on a regular basis, or is it only once a year for us? We had these 2 grandchildren overseas, and we only saw them once a year. But there's a lot we can do now because of technology to overcome some of the distance. And the other one is this: we're all just so busy. It's calendaring everything and having, how can we see so and so? And so again, we usually get called the morning of by our son, who says, "Can you pick up the grandchildren today?" So that has been 2 things. We're checking in with each other, and we actually hear our son's voice, because he's so busy. Why would he want to be talking to his parents right now? all these other things happening. Yeah.
What are some of the ways you think that grandfathers can be mindful a little bit about the birth, maybe triggering some past memories or trauma or something with our spouses? Because there may be things that my wife experienced that I have no idea. And then, the grandchild comes and everybody's supposed to be happy, but grandma's maybe a little withdrawn.
Well, very good point, and very neglected topic. We don't talk about this. There can be an ambivalence that you really wished that you would be grandchild free, perhaps, and maybe now that's the whole thing. And it does trigger. It's called triggering events. And if you have had a depression yourself, and there's an anniversary or something that comes back, it does trigger. And I've had people who read my book see the title of my book, which is Postpartum is Forever, and are horrified because the idea was but I was hospitalized when I had my baby, and I didn't get to see my baby. And now you're telling me that this is going to keep going? Actually, this particular friend, it reawakened for her the fact that she felt unsupported by her husband. 40 years later, she's still thinking about this. So there's a role for therapy in all of this. There are good professionals available. We're very fortunate that we don't have a stigma against getting help that we used to have. And that we need to talk about this. So getting to therapy and hashing these things out is very cathartic, very good for marriages. And my husband and I are still working on all of this. We've been married, is it 55 years, dear? I mean, we're still working on it. But it's very important. And same for the man. I just got reacquainted with a teenage friend. And he found out what I had been doing all these years. We haven't talked in 60 plus years. And he said, "Oh my gosh, I saw your title of your book and it triggered a memory when my firstborn son came, and I was left out in the hallway. And when I was notified that he had been born, I was told by an intern doctor, somebody who didn't know me. He was in the military. And so it was particularly, I didn't get to see my wife. I didn't get to see my newborn son. And he had suppressed all of that feeling. And so we have, right to think and cogitate about these feelings, bring them up and discuss them. And guess what? Talk therapy among friends is absolutely spot on fabulous. It works every time, so long as nobody judges you and how you're responding.
Absolutely. I think that cup of coffee with a friend, that camping trip, that short, easy hike where you can talk and things really does both people a lot of good. And especially when you can be close enough to bring up something. Hey, something's bothering you. I noticed that this is going on. And just listening to them and let them speak.
So I have a question for all the grandpas who are listening to this. Does this conversation make them want to talk to other people, and particularly other granddads and with us or grandmothers too? But is there a place to do so? Is it through the podcast? What happens next? Can you pick up a phone and call a warm line? Could you go to a support group somewhere? Does it feel like grandparents are neglected, particularly fathers and grandfathers?
It does. I would say grandfathers maybe even more so, primarily because I think whether it's social media or just the way things are right now, is that it seems like grandpas should have their stuff together and shouldn't need to be talking about this, these things. Yeah. But it wouldn't be far-fetched to go, hey, that grandfather, at 17 had an unwanted pregnancy with a girlfriend, had that event, and this is coming up, because of this. And I don't know, we do suppress some of that stuff, and we don't talk about it. So I think it is important to be bringing this up, and especially I like how you reinforce that it's not just the grandfather checking in with the daughter-in-law, but it's the son and son-in-law. Are they getting what they need? Are they getting the support? Is somebody listening to them? Are they being taken to the coffee shop?
Right, exactly. I see it on television more, which is good. There are some positive imagery going on, some modeling that's happening, but we all have the responsibility to do this with each other and our best friends, our neighbors, and it's wonderful because once you open up and you, like I started my whole talk with you, is that be vulnerable, share. This has happened to me. This is how it felt. And when over the now decades that I've been doing this, people say, I've never told anybody, but this happened to me too. Or it happened to my cousin, or it happened, and that everybody has a story to share. It's very important to normalize that we are, in fact, not perfect, and but we have each other, and we can be healthy because of that.
I think sometimes too is that when we hear these stories on the news about a mother that has done something tragic with their children or something, that I immediately feel, how did the community miss this? How did somebody not see the struggle that was going on? Because it's not something that you wake up one day and go, oh, I think I'm going to do this, or I'm going to shut down today and not feed my kids, or I'm not going to.
Right.
It's not that. It's a little bit at a time, and it's that network, that community, the friends, whatever, right, that just kind of let it by. They don't stop and talk about it. They don't, hey, how are you doing? What's going on? I'm paying attention. So
yeah, it's true, and I'm glad you're bringing this up, because in the course of my work, I've worked with these families who've had, in fact, the loss of life, with suicide too. I mean, the mother who commits suicide, or the father. I've had every tragedy you can imagine. And why wasn't anybody watching? Well, they were. They didn't know the signs, or the disease itself is so nasty that they're very good at bluffing and showing it off. But infanticide, incarceration of the usually it's the woman who has taken the life. And these are my friends. I write to them in prison still. I mean, this has truly been agonizing. We can do better. Society can do better. And then it brings up a whole lot of other things like foster care and all the other things we don't do well about. All we can do is keep on trying. But I think we are more inclined to realize mental health is important. I just read a shocking comment by somebody who was a young man, 17 years old, and he wrote and he said, well, I was raised to talk about my feelings. My mother was a therapist, but now it's like all over the place and nobody's talking about it. And it's like, oh, well, whatever, it's just my mental health. And they're sort of taking it off like, oh, it's just one of those things, and not taking it seriously. So you have to watch and be open and honest. It's in our schools. It's important. It's in our faith communities, that our clergy are comfortable with the topic. It's important that our coaches and trainers at the gym are talking about this. It's important that the teachers and the principals at our preschool are talking about this and knowing it's just okay. It's just okay. I think the other thing is there's been a lot more acceptance of what we call screening tools or self-help kind of things that it doesn't do very much if, in fact, you can't talk about how you responded in a self-help quiz. Most people are going to lie. Let's be honest. Most people are not going to say, yeah, I feel really awful today, and I feel like, ending my life. And they just, do we do that? And then we have violence. We have all these other things, and it's really is mental illness. It really is mental illness, because nobody in their, what we call the right mind, wants to do this. So it's a wide-ranging topic. It's more than postpartum depression, isn't it, Greg?
It is. It is.
And it is forever. It's going to be quiet because we all love each other. And I think that's the other part of this message, is that this is everlasting love is what keeps the species going, because we do care.
Yeah.
And that we care enough.
Well said. Jane, I've had you on for a little while. Is there anything about postpartum or postpartum depression that you would like to talk about?
Greg, I think we covered a lot and did very, very well. There's always things that are going to come up, and maybe people who are listening to this want to chat with you? Do they get in touch with you? They send emails to you?
Yes. If anybody has any questions, they want to get in touch with us. Certainly, we've got the email in the on the website, and we've also got a comment section for this episode that we'll have there. And then, Jane, how best for people to get in contact with you? I'll be sure to put links in the show notes for us.
Well, that'd be great. It's very easy. My name is Jane, and I'm Jane at Jane Honikman, my whole name. .com. That's my email. And you can Google me and find the books on Amazon and be in touch easily. I am a volunteer for grandparents who want to call PSI, and I get the notification that so-and-so wants to have an email chat, or emails are harder. I really like voice to voice. But I had one recently from a grandmother who wanted to help her daughter through her postpartum, and it was called issues. So another neutral word, not using the word depression.
Right.
Unfortunately, she never got back to me, and I do worry because what's happened to her. But yes, I'm all ears. I love it. I like to talk. I like to share, and I like to promote the topic, which I think is so neglected. So hats off to you for having me on. I appreciate you, Greg, very much.
Well, thank you, and I've enjoyed this conversation. I really appreciated Jan stopping by and having this conversation with me. It was great listening to her experience as well as learning about the different organizations that she's either helped start or has been actively a part of. It's important for us, I think, as fathers and grandfathers to learn more about postpartum depression, and what those terms really mean. It's great that we can be able to educate ourselves so that we can have meaningful conversations with our daughters, our daughter-in-laws, and even our wives. Sometimes there's a lot of things going on around the birth of a child that even as fathers and grandfathers, we're not fully aware of. So this was a great conversation, and I hope you take this information to heart, and I hope that it helps you with your relationships. So thanks for stopping by, and until next time, remember to stay cool. Thank you for listening to the Cool Grandpa Podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do me a favor and share it with a friend. That's the best way you can help us to expand our community, as well as get the news out about how valuable grandpas are in the lives of those kids. If you'd like to leave me a comment or shoot me a potential topic for this podcast, please go to www.cool-grandpa.us. Look for the comments tab, fill it out, hit submit. It's as easy as that. Until next time, remember to stay cool.